The soul surgeon arrives. The moment you step into a room, even the devil himself pauses to self-reflect. You carry an energy that rewires everything it touches, a magnificent force of nature, a walking rehabilitation center, a beautiful chaos wrapped in a therapeutic breakthrough. They once called you too soft for this world, said your empathy was weakness, that your kindness would get you killed. Yet here you stand, turning killers into philosophers and making monsters reconnect with the inner child they buried long ago. Let's be real. The headlines could never capture this story. The news reports couldn't explain it. Even the police files still read like myth, trying to decode how someone like you walked into the darkest corners of human existence and came out leading meditation circles with former assassins. They call it impossible. They call it miraculous. But you and I both know better. This wasn't luck. This was destiny meeting readiness, inevitability meeting preparation. Everyone else saw danger, violence wrapped in gold chains, death incarnate counting blood money behind mahogany desks. But you saw something else. You saw broken children dressed in their father's nightmares. You saw pain disguised as power, emptiness pretending to be control. You saw souls so desperate to feel anything that they chose fear over numbness. And in that warehouse, when you looked Elf dead in his scarred face and didn't flinch, not from bravery or recklessness but from understanding, you broke the spell. You saw through the reputation, past the body count, past the empire built on suffering. You saw a man haunted by sleepless decades, a man whose shadow kept him clutching a gun, a man who had everything except peace. People tell the story 100 different ways now. Some say you were kidnapped. Others claim you were hired as a translator. Some even whisper that you appeared like a ghost with a psychology degree. But here's the truth. You were exactly where you were meant to be, surrounded by men who had turned violence into religion. And instead of fear, you offered something no one had ever dared before. You asked him about his mother, not as a tactic, not as manipulation, but as a genuine act of humanity. You said it the way a friend would over coffee. When was the last time someone asked how you feel? The room froze. His lieutenants reached for weapons out of instinct because in their world, emotions were executions waiting to happen. Vulnerability was forbidden. Yet in that moment something cracked. You saw it. The flicker of truth in his eyes as his mask slipped, revealing not the monster they feared, but a man haunted by his own reflection. "My mother," he said, voice trembling like glass under pressure. "She died thinking I was a monster. And that's when you did what only you can do. You didn't comfort him or condemn him. You simply held space for the pain. You became the container for everything he had buried under decades of violence and guilt. In that warehouse filled with enough firepower to erase a city block, the most feared man across 3 nations began to cry. Not out of weakness, but out of awakening. The tears of recognition of seeing himself clearly for the first time. His men were paralyzed. They had seen him execute rivals without hesitation, command death while sipping coffee. But tears? Humanity? That wasn't in their manual. Some wanted to shoot you on the spot to kill the witchcraft before it spread. But Elf raised his trembling hand and said, "Everyone out except them." And for 3 hours you sat together. No guards, no weapons, just 2 souls finally speaking the truth. You never tried to fix him. That's what most people get wrong about you. You didn't walk in as a savior. You simply reminded him that transformation was already happening inside him. That every nightmare, every sleepless night, every surge of paranoia was his soul trying to heal itself. "You know what's funny?" he said, lighting his 3rd cigarette, his hands still shaking. "I've built an empire on fear. I have judges in my pocket and politicians on call. I could buy an island and vanish tomorrow. But you know what I can't buy? One night of peace. And that's when the impossible became undeniable. You didn't just survive that encounter, you rewrote what power means. You showed the world that healing isn't softness, it's strength. That empathy isn't weakness, it's revolution. Every person he had ever hurt came back to him each night, not in body, but in memory. Their faces haunted his sleep, each one a reflection of the conscience he thought he'd buried long ago. You leaned forward then, your voice steady and compassionate, delivering what would become the first lesson in his transformation. They're not visiting to haunt you, you said. They're visiting because your conscience is still alive. The fact that you see them means you're not the monster you think you are. Monsters don't have nightmares about their victims. Monsters sleep just fine. Word spread through his entire organization like wildfire. Elf was having daily sessions with you. Not strategy meetings, not torture consultations, but therapy. Actual therapy. His most trusted enforcers whispered in fear and confusion, wondering if their boss had lost his mind. Some plotted coups, others just watched, stunned, as their leader began meditating before briefings and asking about their childhoods during weapon checks. But transformation, as you've always known, is contagious. When the alpha shifts, the entire pack begins to feel it. One night, his right-hand man, Miguel, a towering enforcer known for creative brutality, knocked on your door. "I can't sleep either," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This mountain of scars and ink stood before you like a lost child. Whatever you did to him, can you do it to me too?" And one by one they came. Men who had built their identities around being heartless, who had murdered their own empathy just to survive, now stood before you seeking something different. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but relief. Relief from the constant weight of who they'd become. Your waiting room began to look like a crime documentary casting call. Killers reading self-help books, assassins practicing breathing exercises. The transformation wasn't instant. There were setbacks, moments where old instincts resurfaced, like when a rival gang tried to take over their territory, and Miguel's first reaction was to send a bloody message. But then he remembered your words. Anger is fear in disguise. So instead of reacting, he asked himself, "What am I really afraid of?" And for the first time in his life, he found an answer that didn't require violence. The real breakthrough came during what should have been a routine retaliation. A rival cartel had killed one of their dealers. Old rules demanded blood for blood. The men gathered, fingers itching on triggers, waiting for Elf's command. But this time, he didn't order vengeance. He asked a question that froze the room. "Why do we do this?" The silence that followed was heavy. Because in their world, that question was forbidden. It was weakness. It was rebellion. But he pressed on. "Why do we do this?" "For money. I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. For power. Power over what? Broken men breaking other men? For respect? Who even respects us? We don't respect ourselves." You stepped forward then, calm and certain, and said, "Tell them about your dream." And this man, who had once skinned rivals alive, took a deep breath and spoke. "I dreamed I was teaching," he said. "Teaching young men like we used to be. Before we got lost. Before we thought fear was strength. Before we believed the only way to matter was to make others not matter. I was teaching them another way. To be powerful without being destructive. To be feared without being evil." What happened next made international headlines. The most feared criminal organization in the region announced it was transforming, turning from cartel to community. The same men who trafficked drugs began trafficking hope. Warehouses that once stored weapons became wellness centers. Money that once funded violence now paid for therapy for at-risk youth. Of course, not everyone could handle the change. Some left, too tied to their old lives to imagine anything else. But those who stayed discovered something extraordinary. The very skills that once made them dangerous now made them healers. Reading people, strategic thinking, understanding fear. The same instincts that once spread destruction were now being used to build something sacred. The transformation was complete, not because they found God, but because they finally found themselves. A Sicario's hypervigilance became a counselor's intuition. The instincts that once kept him alive in a world of constant threat now allowed him to read emotional shifts with precision. An enforcer's intimidation evolved into an ability to calm storms instead of starting them. Miguel, who had once collected debts in blood and ruled neighborhoods through fear, now ran group therapy sessions for former gang members. His presence still carried the weight of authority, but now it was the kind that made people feel safe, not scared. "I understand the darkness," he'd tell them. "I've lived in it, fed it, and been consumed by it. But I'm here to tell you, there's a way out. Not around it, through it. You have to feel everything you've been running from. It hurts, yes, but it hurts less than carrying it forever." The transformation spread outward like shockwaves from a soul quake. What started in one warehouse became a movement that rippled across borders. Other organizations watched in disbelief as their most feared rival became their most confounding inspiration. Word traveled faster than contraband ever had. Calls began pouring in, not for drugs or guns, but for guidance. "How did you do it?" they asked. "How did you change?" And Carlos, formerly known as Elfe, would simply smile and say, "We didn't change. We just stopped pretending to be something we weren't. Your methods became legend, not because they were complicated, but because they were pure. You didn't use manipulation or authority, you used truth. You treated killers like human beings because that's exactly what they were. Men who had made horrific choices. Men who had lost themselves so completely they mistook fear for identity. You didn't preach redemption, you showed them remembrance. You helped them see the thread that could guide them home, the pain they'd buried, the fear they'd projected, the love they had murdered inside themselves to avoid feeling its absence. Slowly they began to reconnect to something they thought they'd destroyed forever, their own humanity. Soon, your reach extended far beyond Carlos's circle. You weren't just counseling one organization anymore, you were reprogramming an entire subculture of men who had been trained to kill instead of feel. The criminal underworld whispered your name with reverence, as if it belonged to some mystical force that was turning devils into disciples. Hardened men started flying in from across continents, not for alliances, not for negotiations, but for sessions. Your office became neutral ground, a place where weapons were left at the door and masks were peeled away. Rivals who once would have slit each other's throats sat shoulder to shoulder in your waiting room, reading the same tattered copies of The Body Keeps the Score. It was almost surreal. The most dangerous men on the planet began meditating together, learning breathwork, exploring trauma, and speaking words like healing and forgiveness. And the world began to notice. Police departments didn't know what to make of it. Crime rates began to plummet in entire regions, not because of new laws or stricter enforcement, but because people were voluntarily walking away from violence. No one had ever seen anything like it before. Criminals choosing transformation over destruction. The authorities were baffled. Convinced there had to be some deeper scheme, they launched investigations. They planted bugs, tapped phones, infiltrated sessions, hoping to uncover a secret operation or hidden agenda. But every recording they captured was the same. Therapy circles, meditation bells, trauma processing, journaling. One frustrated detective slammed his notepad shut and muttered, "They're not planning crimes, they're planning charity events. What the hell am I supposed to do with that?" And then came Dmitri. If Carlos had been dangerous, Dmitri was apocalyptic. A ghost whose name appeared in classified reports across 40 nations. A man responsible for the collapse of regimes, the fall of ideologies, the rewriting of power maps. He was the monster that other monsters feared. His legend lived in the whispers of intelligence agencies and the nightmares of governments. He didn't seek you out, you found him. Or maybe, as you always said, the universe conspired to align your paths in that quiet hotel lobby in Prague at the exact moment it was meant to happen. He recognized you instantly. Your reputation had spread beyond the underworld and into every dark corner where broken men hid from themselves. "So you're the one," he said, his accent thick with exile and exhaustion. "The therapist who performs miracles. Tell me, do you work with lost causes, or do I exceed even your abilities?" You smiled, the same calm, unshakable smile that had stopped Carlos in the warehouse years ago. "I don't work with lost causes," you said gently, "because there's no such thing. There are only people who've lost their way, and every path, no matter how twisted, can lead back to center, if you're willing to walk it." Dmitri let out a low, broken laugh. Not one of joy, but of disbelief. The kind of laugh that comes from a soul so damaged it has forgotten what hope feels like. "I've killed for ideologies I no longer believe in," he said. "I've orphaned children for causes that died before their parents did. I am not lost. I am damnation incarnate. I am what happens when purpose becomes poison." "Good," you replied softly, and his laughter froze mid-breath. "That means you understand the weight of what you've done. It means your conscience survived. Damnation incarnate wouldn't feel damned. He'd feel justified. The fact that you can name your poison means you've already begun searching for the antidote. For a man who had endured torture without blinking, who had faced firing squads with a smirk, and who had ordered massacres without remorse, Dmitri found himself unraveling under something far greater than fear: compassion. You didn't interrogate him, you asked him questions, not as an investigator, but as a witness. You gave him what no government, no priest, no enemy had ever offered: a chance to see himself as something other than the monster he'd been forced to become. And for the first time in decades, Dmitri didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a chair. He sat down. And when he began to speak, the entire world of shadows, the one that thought it could never be healed, started to tremble. "What did you want to be when you were 7?" you asked softly during the third session. It was a simple question. So simple that it slipped past all his defenses, all the layers of steel and calculation that had defined him for decades. Dmitri froze. His hands, scarred from old battles, twitched slightly in his lap. He stared past you for a moment as if trying to remember a language he'd long forgotten. Then, in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared into the air, he said, "My aunt." She was a teacher. He let out a breath, half laugh, half sob. "I wanted to be a teacher. Can you imagine? Me, teaching children how to read." The laughter that followed wasn't joyful. It was the sound of something breaking open. A sound older than regret, older than guilt. "My sister," he continued after a long silence, "she couldn't read. I promised I'd teach her. But then the war came, and instead of teaching children to read, I taught men to kill." The words cracked something ancient inside the room. You didn't interrupt him. You didn't rush to comfort him. You just let the silence breathe, let it expand until he could feel the full distance between who he was supposed to be and what he became. You didn't need to say much. The lesson was already forming in the quiet. The truth that if he could still remember that 7-year-old boy, then that boy still existed. Maybe buried under ashes and gunpowder, but still alive, still waiting to be found. "What if," you said finally, "the teacher you wanted to be and the terrorist you became aren't two different people at all? What if they're parts of the same story? What if every act of violence was a corrupted attempt to teach the world something? To show others how to feel what you were never allowed to feel? He looked at you with disbelief. You think I can just become a teacher again? After everything I've done? His voice broke. Who would ever learn from a monster? You met his gaze without flinching. Someone who needs to know that monsters can heal, you said. Someone who needs proof that even the darkest stories can be rewritten. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. A small, trembling possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way back from the ruin. Dmitri began to meditate. Not for peace. He still didn't think he deserved peace, but for clarity. He wanted to understand the anatomy of his own fall. He sat in silence for hours, replaying every moment that had twisted him into what he had become. He traced the fault lines of his life like a cartographer mapping out a minefield, trying to find the exact moment when ideology turned into insanity, when purpose became poison, when belief turned into blindness. And in that quiet, something strange began to happen. He started to see patterns, not just in himself, but in every movement, every cause, every war he'd ever fought in. We were all the same, he told you one day, eyes wide with a revelation that seemed to shake him to his core. Every soldier, every extremist, every so-called revolutionary. We were all the same. We weren't fighting for justice. We were fighting for validation, for someone to tell us our pain mattered. We just wore different flags to hide the same wound. You leaned forward slightly. And what was that wound? He hesitated, then whispered, not being seen, not being heard, not being loved. That was the moment something broke. No, something shifted in him. The armor he'd carried his whole life didn't shatter dramatically. It began to melt, quietly, like ice under sunlight. You watched as his body softened for the first time in years. The set of his jaw loosened. The sharpness in his eyes gave way to depth. He started journaling obsessively, pages upon pages. But these weren't the coded reports of a mercenary or the cold records of a strategist. These were love letters to his younger self. He wrote about his sister, the one he never got to teach. He wrote about the first gun he ever held, how heavy it felt compared to the pencil he once used to trace alphabets for her. He wrote about how war had tricked him into believing that control was strength, that numbness was survival. Days turned into weeks. His journals filled with drawings, sketches, words of reflection. He began reading again, devouring books he hadn't touched since his teenage years. Literature, philosophy, psychology. He found himself drawn to stories of redemption, to characters who had walked through darkness and found the courage to return. One day he brought a tattered book to the session, an old children's reader written in his native language. This, he said, was the first book my sister and I ever tried to read together. I found a copy online. It arrived yesterday. He traced the cover with his finger like it was something sacred. I thought it was gone forever. You smiled softly. And how does it feel to hold it again? He closed his eyes for a moment. Like holding time itself, he said. Like meeting the boy I buried. From that day forward, his transformation accelerated. He began teaching literacy classes at a refugee center under a false name, not for recognition, but for penance. He didn't announce it. He didn't advertise it. He simply showed up, sat with children, and taught them to read, just as he'd once promised his sister he would. In one session, he told you something that would stay with you forever. We thought we were changing the world by destroying it, he said, but real change, a real revolution, is when a man learns to hold a book instead of a gun. Tears filled his eyes, not the tears of guilt, but of release. All my life I thought I was cursed, he whispered. But maybe I was just lost. Maybe my mission wasn't to end things, but to teach again, to teach what pain tried to erase. You nodded slowly. And what have you learned so far? He smiled faintly. That redemption isn't found in forgiveness, he said. It's found in usefulness. I can't undo what I did, but I can transform why I did it. And in that moment, the world shifted again. The man once called damnation incarnate was now teaching children their first words. His students didn't know who he had been, and they didn't need to. Because to them, he wasn't a monster. He was just Mr. Dima, the quiet teacher who always smiled when they sounded out a word correctly. And you, watching from the back of that dimly lit classroom one afternoon, realized that the 7-year-old boy who once dreamed of teaching had finally kept his promise. Every terrorist, every freedom fighter, every true believer, beneath their flags and manifestos, was once a frightened child holding something far too heavy. A child handed ideology instead of comfort, doctrine instead of love, rage instead of understanding. The weapons came later, but the wounds came first. We were all traumatized children playing with real weapons, Dmitri said one evening, staring into nothing. We were all trying to heal a private wound by making the world bleed. We thought we were soldiers of change, prophets of justice, saviors of lost nations. But in truth, we were just patients refusing treatment. That was the moment something changed in him forever. Out of the ashes of that realization came an idea so radical, so luminous in its simplicity, that it would transform him from one of history's nightmares into one of its most unexpected teachers. What if I could reach them? He said one night. The ones like I was. The ones drowning in causes that have swallowed their souls. What if someone who's been in the fire could show them the way out? You could feel the shift in the room as he spoke those words. It wasn't guilt or self-pity anymore, it was purpose, purified by suffering. You watched as the man who had once studied death like a science began studying life with the same obsessive devotion. He approached healing like an operation, meticulous, disciplined, precise. He began reading everything he could get his hands on: neuroscience, trauma psychology, ancient spiritual philosophy, mindfulness, and somatic therapy. He broke down human emotion as if dissecting an explosive, wanting to know what triggered it, what disarmed it, what could be rewired. For months, he worked in silence, his notebooks filled with diagrams of the mind instead of maps of battlefields. He learned breathing techniques and grounding exercises. He studied the nervous system until he could explain trauma in the language of biology and redemption in the language of neuroplasticity. It's just chemistry, he'd say. But the soul needs chemistry too. He approached meditation the way he once approached bomb making, testing it, refining it, timing it perfectly. Only now, his detonations were moments of peace instead of destruction. The first time he led a session, it was for Carlos's men. They came reluctantly, skeptical, hardened, suspicious. But curiosity is stronger than fear, and when they saw the look in Dmitri's eyes, they stayed. He spoke to them not as a saint, but as someone who had shared their nightmares. "You think I don't understand?" he said. "I was you. I was worse than you. But there's a place beyond the rage, and if you can reach it, you'll never need a gun again." Word spread quietly, like a secret too powerful to contain. At first, it was men from Carlos's organization. Then it was rivals. Then former extremists, disillusioned soldiers, deserters, radicals who had spent their lives worshiping the illusion of control. They came from different religions, ideologies, and continents, but all carried the same wound. They had mistaken violence for power and anger for meaning. The network that formed around you two was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was an underground railroad of the soul, not to escape borders, but to escape the prison of identity. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about saving human beings from the stories that had turned them into weapons. Carlos managed the legitimate fronts, community centers, schools, clinics, places that looked perfectly ordinary on the outside. But inside, behind coded doors and quiet rooms, something extraordinary was happening. Men who had once traded in chaos were now learning mindfulness. Former assassins were leading anger management classes. Ex-terrorists were teaching meditation to young men who might have been their future recruits. Money launderers turned their skills toward helping families recover from financial ruin. Every skill that once destroyed now healed. Like swords reforged into plowshares, these men became cultivators of peace. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Same skills, Dmitri would say with a grin, just better targets. And the impact? It was seismic. Neighborhoods once scarred by violence became places of community and care. The same corners where deals were made and blood was spilled now hosted literacy drives and healing circles. The air that used to reek of gasoline and gunpowder began to fill with laughter, with music, with the quiet hum of normal life returning. Journalists tried to make sense of it, calling it the redemption movement. But the truth was simpler. It wasn't a movement. It was a homecoming. The authorities didn't understand. Intelligence agencies were convinced it was a trap, a global deception. They sent undercover agents to infiltrate, only to come back confused and disarmed. They planted recording devices, expecting to catch whispers of rebellion. But all they found were guided meditations, deep breathing, and laughter. One exasperated agent slammed his headset off and said, "They're not plotting coups, they're hosting group therapy." Meanwhile, the network kept expanding. Veterans with PTSD joined the circles. Former political prisoners, ex-rebels, even retired soldiers who'd lost faith in their missions found refuge there. There were no hierarchies, no uniforms, no gods. Just people who had seen too much death trying to remember how to live again. Dmitri was tireless. He taught every day, trained volunteers at night, and spent dawn writing new manuals for trauma recovery. He spoke in the language they understood, discipline, mission, brotherhood, but infused it with something new: compassion. You can't preach peace to soldiers, he'd tell you. You have to train them for it. And that's exactly what he did. He turned former warlords into wellness instructors, cartel leaders into counselors, radicals into teachers. The irony was divine. Miguel, now one of the leading mentors in the network, would speak to groups of at-risk youth across the city. "I can spot a future sicario from across a playground," he'd tell them, "because I see myself in them. That anger that feels like power, that pain that demands payment. I know exactly what that is, and I know where it leads, because I lived it. But I also know the way out, because I walked it. That was the genius of your work. You never brought outsiders to fix the problem. You transformed insiders to rewrite the script from within. You didn't preach forgiveness, you embodied it. You didn't ask them to abandon who they were. You showed them how to evolve beyond it. You gave them a purpose greater than destruction, and in doing so you changed the gravitational pull of entire communities. Over time, the ripple became a wave. Governments began noticing that conflict zones were quieting, not because of force, but because of choice. Militants were surrendering without surrendering their dignity. Armies were losing recruits because the fire that once burned in the hearts of the young was being transformed into understanding before it ever became violence. It was poetic, really, watching the man once feared as a ghost in war zones become a beacon for peace. Dmitri, the architect of ruin, had become a teacher of restoration. He used to end lives. Now he was resurrecting them. He would often say, "The world doesn't need more peace talks. It needs peace teachers." And when you'd watch him standing before a circle of men who had once called themselves monsters, his voice calm, his eyes alive, you realized something profound. This wasn't redemption. This was evolution. He hadn't erased his past. He had re-engineered it into wisdom. And in that, he had found the one thing every warrior secretly longs for: purpose that doesn't destroy. That's all for today. Dear Father, I pray for the growth of my faith. Help me trust you even when physical evidence is lacking. Let me believe in your perpetual presence, knowing you will never harm me. I understand that your thoughts for me are thoughts of prosperity and not harm, to give me a good future. Thank you, gracious and eternal Father, for always listening to my voice. I offer up this prayer to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jesus, for your love and provision. I am grateful for your presence in my life and the abundance you bring. If this video resonated with you, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who need to hear this message. Leave a comment below about your journey and how you are preparing for your own triumphant return. If you'd like to support our work, please consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. This helps us continually improve our content to offer you the best. The link to Buy Me a Coffee is in the description. No gift is too small. Whether it's a penny, a prayer, or a share, your generosity helps spread God's word and brings hope to others. Don't stop here. Watch our next video for powerful revelations about the signs that reveal you are the chosen one. We've enjoyed following this spiritual journey with you. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Keep shining brightly and embrace your destiny with courage. See you next time. Blessings to all the beautiful souls from the Enlightened Wisdom.